The world had been reduced to a maelstrom of mud and thunder. Rain, driven sideways by a wind that shrieked like a banshee, stung Alara's face, each drop a tiny needle of ice. Beneath her, the great black stallion, Shadow, stumbled, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged, desperate gasps. He was dying. She could feel the life draining from him with every shuddering step, the powerful muscles trembling not just from exhaustion, but from the searing pain of the gash on his flank. It was a deep, wicked wound, a souvenir from the splintered fence post they crashed through 2 hours ago, or maybe a lifetime. Clinging to her back, his small arms wrapped tight around her waist, was her son. Leo, all of 7 years old, buried his face in the damp wool of her coat, his small body a rigid knot of terror. He didn't make a sound. He hadn't in days. The silence was a language they both now spoke fluently, a dialect born of gunpowder and shattered glass. Almost there, Shadow, she mouthed, the words a silent prayer swallowed by the storm. But it was a lie. There was no there. There was only the endless, roaring dark of the prairie, a desolate ocean that had already swallowed their past and was now coming for their future. Another flash of lightning tore the sky open, and for a split second, the world was bleached white. In that stark, terrifying light, she saw it, a faint, flickering pinpoint of gold, a ghost of a light far across the plains. A lamp in a window, a ranch, hope, or a different kind of trap. It didn't matter. It was their only chance. Shadow felt it too. He summoned the last dregs of his strength, lunging forward through the sucking mud. The light grew, resolving into the square outline of a small, solitary cabin. A crude wooden gate marked the edge of the property, leaning crookedly as if it had long since given up on keeping the world out. They were yards away when the stallion's legs finally gave out. He went down with a low, guttural cry of defeat, his great body collapsing into the mud. Alara threw herself clear, twisting her body to cushion Leo's fall. They landed in the cold, wet earth, the impact jarring her to the bone. Leo's arms tightened around her, his shivering a frantic vibration against her own. For a moment, she just lay there, the rain hammering down, the fight finally gone from her. This was it, the end of the line. They had run so far, only to die in the mud at a stranger's gate. Then the light from the cabin door spilled out across the yard. A figure emerged, a silhouette against the warm glow, impossibly tall and broad. He carried a lantern, its light swinging in a steady arc that seemed utterly unbothered by the gale. As he drew closer, the light illuminated a face carved from granite, all hard plains and grim shadow, framed by a thick, dark beard. He moved with a heavy, deliberate tread, his presence as formidable and unforgiving as the storm itself. But it was his hands that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. As he raised the lantern, the light fell upon them. They were a horrific tapestry of scar tissue, the skin pulled tight and shiny, webbed with the ghost of an ancient, terrible fire. They were the hands of a man who had clawed his way out of hell. He stopped a few feet from them, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an unnerving calm. He looked at her, then at the trembling boy she shielded with her body, and finally, his eyes settled on the fallen horse. A low groan escaped Shadow's lips, his magnificent head lifting weakly from the mud before falling back. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He moved past Alara and Leo as if they were nothing more than rocks in his path and knelt beside the stallion. His movements, which should have been clumsy, deformed things, were instead impossibly gentle. He ran one of his scarred hands over the horse's trembling neck, his touch communicating a calm authority that seemed to quiet the animal's fear. Shadow's frantic breathing eased, just a fraction. The man's attention was absolute, a silent conversation passing between man and beast. After a long moment, he turned his head, his gaze finally meeting Alara's. He didn't speak. He simply jerked his chin toward the cabin, a curt, unmistakable command. Go. Then he turned his full attention back to the horse, his scarred fingers probing the edges of the bleeding gash on Shadow's flank. He was a doctor, a priest, a confessor, and in that moment, Alara knew he was their only salvation. Clutching Leo's hand, she staggered to her feet and half ran, half limped toward the impossible warmth of the cabin door. Inside, The silence was as profound as the storm's fury. A fire was already blazing in a stone hearth, its heat reaching out to her like a physical embrace. The cabin was Spartan, containing little more than a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a simple cot. It was the home of a man who owned nothing he couldn't carry, or perhaps a man who had lost everything he ever had. She stood dripping in the center of the room, Leo clinging to her leg, watching the door. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Finally, the door opened. The man stepped inside, his clothes soaked, mud clinging to his boots. He closed the door, shutting out the storm, and the cabin was plunged into a heavy, watchful quiet. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He still hadn't spoken a single word. Then he turned his gaze to the deep gash on Shadow's flank, which he had cleaned and packed with some kind of dark, herbal poultice. But as his fingers had worked, clearing the blood and torn hide, he had seen something else. Beneath the main brand of Alara's old ranch, a lazy J, was another mark, smaller and deliberately obscured. It wasn't a cattle brand. It was a symbol, cryptic and sharp, like the stylized claw of a raptor. It felt wrong. It whispered of a world far more organized and far more sinister than that of a simple homesteader. He filed the detail away, his face betraying nothing, and looked back at the woman and child who had brought this trouble to his doorstep. His sanctuary had been breached. Alara awoke to a quiet so profound it felt louder than the storm. For a moment, she lay perfectly still on the simple cot, her senses straining against the unfamiliar peace. The wind no longer clawed at the cabin walls. The rain was gone. In its place was the soft, rhythmic crackle of the hearth and the gentle scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. The first thing she saw was Leo. He was sitting on the floor by the cabin's single window, his knees drawn to his chest, utterly transfixed by the scene outside. Alara followed his gaze. In the circular corral, bathed in the clean, sharp light of morning, stood Silas. He was not looking at the cabin. His entire being was focused on Shadow, who stood in the center of the enclosure, head high, nostrils flared. The horse was no longer a broken thing in the mud. He was magnificent again, wary but alive. Silas held no rope, no whip. He simply stood there, his scarred hands held loosely at his sides, moving in a slow, circular pattern around the animal. It was a dance, a silent conversation of posture and breath. When Shadow shifted nervously, Silas would stop, stand perfectly still, and wait. It was an exercise in patience so absolute it felt like a form of prayer. Life on the ranch settled into that same silent rhythm. Silas was a ghost who left offerings in his wake. Each morning, a loaf of dense, freshly baked bread would appear on the table alongside a strip of dried jerky. The tear in Leo's small coat, ripped during their fall, was mended with small, surprisingly neat stitches. He moved around Alara as if she were a piece of furniture, his gaze always sliding past her, never landing. He was a provider of needs, not a seeker of connection. But with Leo, it was different. The boy, drawn by an irresistible curiosity, started spending his hours perched on the top rail of the corral fence, watching the silent man and the wounded horse. On the second day, Silas stopped his work, walked over to the feed bin, and returned with a handful of oats. Without a word, he held it out to Leo. The boy hesitated, then slid from the fence and took the offering. Silas gently guided the boy's hand, showing him how to hold it flat so the horse's soft lips could brush against his palm. He spoke to Leo then, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, too quiet for Alara to hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Instruction, gentle and sure. From that moment, a fragile bridge was built between the silent man and the quiet boy. Leo became Silas's shadow, helping him carry buckets of water, learning the names of the herbs Silas ground into the poultice for Shadow's flank. In these shared, wordless tasks, the terror began to recede from her son's eyes, replaced by a steady, focused calm. He was healing. Driven by a desperate need to understand the man who was mending her son, Alara began to explore. The ranch was a fortress of functionality. The barn was meticulously organized, every tool cleaned and hung in its proper place. The cabin was scrubbed clean, but it was a sterile environment, devoid of history. There were no photographs, No worn books on a shelf, no faded keepsakes. It was the home of a man who lived entirely in the present because his past was a room he had sealed shut. She found the key to that room on the third day. A small, windswept hill rose behind the barn, overlooking the vast, empty sweep of the prairie. At its crest stood a single, weathered wooden cross. It was stark and simple, bleached nearly white by the sun. There was no name carved into it, no date, just the silent, lonely vigil of a loss so profound its owner couldn't even bear to give it a name. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, a cold knot of understanding tightening in her chest. This man's silence wasn't a choice. It was a scar. The fragile piece shattered on the fifth day. Alara was washing plates in a basin when the sound drifted in on the wind. The distant sound of men's voices, loud and careless, punctuated by a burst of boisterous laughter. It was an alien sound in this world of quietude, a violent intrusion. Her head snapped up, her body going rigid. She flew to the door and peered out. Two riders were passing on the old trail a quarter-mile away, their shapes dark against the horizon. They were just travelers, nothing more, but the sound of their casual, masculine world sent a jolt of pure, chemical terror through her. She grabbed Leo, who was sitting at the table, and pulled him down to the floor behind it, her hand clamped over his mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her breath came in shallow, silent gasps. It was a reflexive, uncontrollable reaction, the conditioned terror of a hunted animal. From the corral, Silas saw it all. He had been running his hand along Shadow's back, his scarred fingers testing the healing wound, when the sound of the riders had made him look up. He saw Alara's reaction, the frantic speed, the primal fear. He saw the way she shielded her son, turning her body into a barricade against a threat only she could see. He stopped his work, his face hardening, the lines around his eyes deepening. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard finality of a jail cell door slamming shut. The desperate flight through the storm, her muteness, the child's haunted eyes, and now this. He looked from her huddled form behind the table to the vast, empty prairie that stretched in every direction. This ranch, his fortress of silence, had just become their cage. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that this woman and her boy were not just lost. They were prey, and the hunters were out there, somewhere beyond the horizon. The nightmare came without warning, a phantom clawing its way out of the deep well of the night. Alara was back in their small homestead, the air thick with the smell of lamp oil and her husband Daniel's pipe tobacco. Then came the splintering crash of the front door, the shattering of glass, and the sight of two figures, their faces obscured by shadow and malice, stepping into their home. She saw Daniel rise, his chair clattering to the floor, his hands held up in a gesture of peace that was met with a roar of gunpowder. She saw his eyes, wide with shock and a love so fierce it broke her heart, just before the light went out of them forever. She awoke with a silent scream trapped in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat, every muscle locked in a rictus of terror. The cabin was dark, the fire in the hearth reduced to a soft, orange glow. Leo was a small, still lump under a blanket on the floor, blessedly asleep. Forcing her trembling limbs to move, Alara slid off the cot and went to the door, desperate for a breath of clean, cold air to wash the gunpowder from her memory. She opened the door a crack and froze. Silas was standing on the porch, his back to her, a rifle held loosely in one of his scarred hands. He was simply standing there, a silent, unmoving sentinel staring out into the impenetrable darkness. He wasn't intruding, he was guarding. He had heard her thrashing in the throes of her nightmare, had sensed her distress, and had come to stand watch against the demons that haunted her waking hours as well as her sleeping ones. His quiet act of protection was a balm to her raw nerves, but the peace was short-lived. The outside world arrived the next afternoon in the form of a rickety cart pulled by a mule with one ear. Its driver was a traveling peddler named Finch, a wiry man with a gossip's sharp eyes and a voice that filled the ranch's silence like a sack of clattering tins. "Howdy, folks. Finch is the name. Notions are my game," he chirped, tipping his sweat-stained hat. "Got everything from thread to tonic for what ails ya?" Silas appeared from the barn, his presence an immediate and heavy counterpoint to the peddler's breezy demeanor. Alara remained in the doorway, Leo peeking out from behind her skirts. Finch's eyes darted between them, his gaze lingering on Alara for a beat too long. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Well now," he said, stroking his chin. "Ain't this a picture? Heard tell of a woman and her boy gone missing over near the Black Creek settlement." Caused quite a stir. Silas took a deliberate step forward, his shadow falling over the peddler. He began cleaning a bridle, his scarred hands working the leather with a slow, menacing rhythm. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. Finch, unnerved, cleared his throat and hurried on. "Folks say the farmer she was with, name of Daniel, had a run-in with Marcus Thorne. You know Thorne, the land baron buying up everything with a deed and a water source. Man's got a pair of enforcers, mean as rattlers, who do his dirty work. They say Daniel refused Thorne's offer. And, well, he let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. Now Thorne's men are asking after a mute woman and her boy. Say she's the only one who saw what really happened." Alara's blood ran cold. The whispers had found them. Silas continued his work, his gaze never leaving the peddler. The air grew thick with a tension that Finch could no longer ignore. "Right then," he said, forcing a smile. "Just passing through. No trouble here." He fumbled in his cart. "Here, boy," he said, holding out a small object to Leo. "A little trinket for you. Found it on the trail." It was a small bird, crudely whittled from a piece of pine. Leo, his face lighting up with a rare spark of childlike delight, took it from him. Finch, eager to be gone, tipped his hat again and urged his mule back onto the path, the cart rattling away into the vast emptiness of the prairie. As soon as he was out of sight, Silas stepped onto the porch. His eyes weren't on Alara, but on the small wooden bird clutched in Leo's hand. Carved into the bird's side was a distinctive, cross-hatched notch, a small, stylized raptor's claw. Upon seeing it, Silas's hand, the one not holding the bridle, clenched into a fist. The scarred skin on his knuckles stretched, turning a waxy, bloodless white. A flicker of something, a deep, ancient pain, crossed his face before he masked it, but Alara saw it. The symbol meant something to him, something terrible. He looked from the bird to Shadow, who was now standing peacefully in the corral, his flank healing cleanly. And he knew with a sickening certainty that the pattern on that bird was identical to the strange, half-hidden brand he had discovered on the horse's hide. The whispers on the wind had just become a roar, and the violence of the past was no longer a memory. It was a map, and all roads on it led directly to his door. The next morning, Alara found Silas in the main corral with a creature of pure, chaotic energy. It was a wild Mustang, its coat the color of sun-scorched clay, its eyes blazing with a defiant fire. The horse was a storm of flashing hooves and panicked snorts, a living embodiment of the untamed prairie. Alara pulled Leo close, her hand resting on his shoulder as they watched from the safety of the fence line. Silas used no force. He held no rope, no whip, no tools of breaking. He simply moved with the animal, a slow, patient orbit of calm. When the Mustang charged, Silas didn't retreat. He stood his ground, turning his body slightly, a gesture that was not a challenge but an invitation to look. When the horse reared, lashing out with its front legs, Silas simply waited, his scarred hands held open at his sides until the fit of terror passed. He was not taming the wildness out of the horse. He was making a silent promise. "I'm not a threat. This is a safe place." Watching him, Alara felt a profound shift inside her. He was not trying to break the horse's spirit. He was asking for its trust. This was his language, the one he had been speaking to her and Leo since the moment they arrived. It was a language of patience, of gentle strength, of allowing a wounded thing the space to heal without demanding it submit. He was showing the horse the same thing he had shown her son, that a life lived in fear did not have to be the only life. The sight of the whittled bird, however, had broken his own fragile peace. Later that day, his movements lost their fluid calm. He approached Shadow in the barn, his jaw tight. With a gentleness that seemed to cost him a great deal, he coaxed the stallion into the light and began to clean the nearly healed wound with a fresh poultice. With the scab and dried blood finally gone, the brand was stark against the horse's black hide. A raptor's claw, seeing it, clear and undeniable, triggered a violent reaction in him. He recoiled as if he'd been struck, stumbling back a step, his face ashen. The confident horse whisperer vanished, replaced by a haunted man. He turned and walked out of the barn without a word, retreating into a silence that was heavier and more pained than any Alara had yet witnessed. For the rest of the day, he was a ghost, a presence felt but not seen. His turmoil a palpable force that settled over the ranch like a shroud. That night, the tension was a suffocating weight. The silence in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was fraught with his unspoken agony. Unable to bear it, Alara left Leo sleeping and crossed the dark yard to the barn. She found him there, sitting on a hay bale in the deep shadows, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight from the hayloft. He was staring at nothing, his scarred hands resting, palms up, in his lap. They looked like ruined relics, the source of his skill now the source of his shame. He looked utterly broken. She didn't speak. Words were not their language. Instead, she quietly pulled over a small wooden crate and sat near him, a silent companion in his vigil. She offered him the only thing she had, her presence. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the horses in their stalls and the distant cry of a coyote. Finally, he spoke, his voice a rasp of disuse and pain, as if the words themselves were being torn from his throat. "The brand," he began, his gaze still fixed on the darkness. "It was our mark. We called ourselves the Raptors." Alara waited, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. "Marcus Thorne was our leader. He found me when I was just a boy, a runaway with a knack for horses. He saw my gift, and he used it. I was his horse master. I acquired the best mounts, trained them for speed and for silence. I gave his men the legs they rode on to do what they did." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes hollowed out by memory. "I took his coin. I ate at his table. I told myself my work was clean, that the blood they spilled wasn't on my hands. But it was. It was on every bridle I oiled, every saddle I cinched." He took a ragged breath. Then came the breaking point. A family, homesteaders with a deed to land Thorne wanted for a silver vein he'd found. They wouldn't sell. They had 2 small children. Thorne ordered us to ride on them in the night, to burn them out, to leave no witnesses. He shook his head slowly, the memory playing out in his dark eyes. I said no. For the first time, I said no. I told him I trained horses, not killers of children. He held up his scarred hands in the moonlight, the web of ruined flesh a ghostly white. "This was my price for defiance," he whispered, and the story came tumbling out, raw and horrifying. Thorne and 3 of his men had held him down in the forge. They had mocked him, called him a coward, and then they had taken his hands, the source of his pride and his skill, and held them in the glowing embers. It was a punishment meant not just to cause pain, but to destroy him, to ensure he could never ride against them, never be a threat again. He had escaped that night, half dead and utterly broken, and had been running from his own ghost ever since. As his story ended, the barn fell silent once more, but the silence had changed. Alara looked at him, at the man who had been branded by the same fire that had consumed her own life. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He wasn't a mysterious recluse. He was a fellow survivor. The monster that haunted her nightmares was the same monster that had forged his scars. In that moment, a bond was formed between them far deeper than gratitude or pity. It was a shared, intimate knowledge of the same evil. An unspoken vow passed between them in the quiet darkness of the barn. They were no longer just 2 victims hiding from the world. They were 2 soldiers in the same war, and the enemy had just found their fortress. The thunder came not from the sky, but from the earth. It started as a low, distant rumble that grew with unnerving speed, the rhythmic pounding of hoofbeats in the hard-packed dirt. Silas, who had been teaching Leo how to mend a leather strap on the porch, looked up, his body going unnaturally still. Alara, inside the cabin, heard it too. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bone, a predator's signature. 2 riders appeared on the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the brilliant blue sky. They didn't hesitate, didn't scout. They moved with the arrogant, unhurried confidence of wolves who know they have cornered their prey, riding directly down into the ranch yard. Alara rushed to the doorway, pulling Leo behind her. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. The men reined in their horses, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly, like a shroud. Alara recognized one of them instantly. It was the man from her nightmare, the one who had pulled the trigger, his face a cruel mask of cold amusement. The other was younger, but his eyes held the same deadened emptiness. The leader's gaze fell on Silas, and his smirk widened into a look of genuine shock, followed by a dark, predatory glee. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, his voice a lazy, confident weapon. "Look what the wind blew in from the dead, Silas. Last I saw you, you were screaming for your mama in a blacksmith's forge." Silas didn't react to the taunt. He rose slowly to his feet, placing himself between the men and the cabin door, his body a solid, unmoving shield. The man's eyes flicked to Alara and Leo. "So this is where you crawled off to, playing nursemaid to a mute and her whelp. Thorn's going to get a real kick out of this. He sent us to collect the witness. Looks like we get a traitor in the bargain." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with a sound that made Alara's stomach clench. He started toward the porch, his eyes locking on Leo, his intentions clear. "Come on, boy. Your mama can't protect you." That was the catalyst. The sight of that man, the killer of her husband, reaching for her son, was a spark hitting a keg of black powder. Something inside Alara, a dam of grief and terror that had held for months, shattered into a million pieces. A sound ripped from her throat. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, primal, and utterly ferocious scream. No, the force of it was a physical blow. It was the sound of every nightmare, every silent terror, every ounce of repressed rage and terror she had carried, unleashed in a single, explosive moment. The riders flinched. Silas, for a split second, was stunned. Even Alara herself seemed shocked by the power of the voice she had thought was lost forever. But that 1 second was all Silas needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. The years of quiet ranch work had not dulled the brutal instincts of his past. He exploded forward, ignoring the searing pain in his hands, his body a blur of controlled violence. He slammed his shoulder into the leader's chest, driving him back against his horse. The man's pistol, half drawn, clattered to the ground. Silas's hand, the scarred and ruined one, chopped down on the man's wrist with the force of a hammer, and a sickening crack echoed through the yard. At the same instant, Alara, galvanized by the return of her own power, moved without thinking. Her world had narrowed to a single, burning purpose: protect her child. She snatched the heavy, cast-iron skillet from the edge of the outdoor cooking fire, its surface still radiating a faint heat. The second man, distracted by the melee, turned just in time to see her coming. She swung the skillet with all the strength of her grief and fury, bringing it down on the side of his head with a dull, sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. The fight was over in less than 10 seconds. It was a desperate, brutal, and decisive victory. The yard fell silent again, the only sounds the panicked snorting of the horses and Alara's own ragged breathing. She stood over the unconscious man, the skillet still gripped in her hand, her knuckles white. Her voice had returned, not as a whisper, but as a roar. She had been a victim for so long, a ghost haunted by the violence of others. But in that moment, swinging a simple piece of kitchen iron, she had become a defender, a warrior. Silas stood over the other man, who was clutching his broken wrist and whimpering in the dirt. He looked at Alara, at the fierce, protective fire blazing in her eyes, at the skillet held like a weapon, and then at Leo, who was staring at his mother with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. The hunters had become the hunted. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had just declared a war. Marcus Thorne now knew that the mute witness could speak, and that his long-lost horsemaster was not only alive, but was willing to fight. Their sanctuary had just become a battlefield. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and pale gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. On the porch, a new kind of silence had settled over them. It was not the silence of fear, nor the heavy quiet of unspoken trauma. It was the calm, steady silence of solidarity. Alara held a warm mug of coffee between her hands, the heat seeping into her skin, grounding her in the present. Beside her, Silas sat on the top step, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Leo was asleep inside, his nightmares finally banished by the raw, protective power of his mother's voice. In the barn, Thorne's 2 enforcers were bound, gagged, and nursing their wounds, a problem that the rising sun demanded they solve. Alara took a sip of coffee. The simple act felt like a miracle. Her throat was raw, but the pathways were clear. Daniel was a good man, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Too trusting. He believed the law would protect him. Silas nodded, his eyes never leaving the distant hills. Thorn is the law in 3 counties. He buys sheriffs like he buys cattle. I can describe them, Alara continued. The memory is no longer a paralyzing flood, but a clear, cold stream of evidence. The man I hit, his name is Cole. The other, the one who shot Daniel, is named Red. He has a tattoo of a snake on his neck. Silas's jaw tightened. I know them both. He turned to her, his expression grim but resolute. Their testimony won't be enough. Thorn will claim they acted alone, or he'll have them silenced in a jail cell before they can speak. But your voice, your testimony is different. You're the victim, the witness, and I know what Thorn has done. I know the names, the dates, the locations of graves that have never been found. A plan began to form between them, woven from her eyewitness account and his insider knowledge. It was a desperate gamble, a single arrow aimed at the heart of a corrupt and powerful empire. There's a man, Silas said, his voice low, a federal marshal based out of the territorial capital in Prescott. His name is Hobbs. He's a straight-backed old bull who hates corruption more than he hates sin. Thorn could never buy him. They made their decision. They chose Cole, the younger, weaker of the 2 captured men, whose bravado had dissolved into a puddle of terrified whimpering. Silas laid out the deal to him in the stark morning light of the barn. Carry a message to Marshal Hobbs in Prescott, detailing Thorn's crimes and offering Silas's and Alara's full testimony in exchange for federal protection. If he did it, he might get a reduced sentence. If he ran back to Thorn, Hobbs would be notified anyway, and Thorn would kill him for getting caught. Cole, his face pale with fear, agreed without a moment's hesitation. They sent him on his way with 1 horse, a canteen of water, and the fear of God, or at least the fear of Marcus Thorn, to speed him on his way. Red, the killer, they kept tied in the barn, a piece of insurance. The weeks that followed were a strange, suspended time. The threat was a constant presence on the horizon, but within the small circle of the ranch, a new life began to take root. Alara, finding her voice, also found her strength. She and Silas no longer operated as host and guest, but as partners. They worked side by side, mending the fences, clearing new ground for a small garden, their hands often brushing in the shared labor of building a future. She spoke of Daniel, not with the raw agony of fresh grief, but with the quiet reverence of loving memory. Silas, in turn, spoke of the family he had lost, the wife and daughter buried under that unmarked cross on the hill, taken by a fever years ago, a loss that had hollowed him out and sent him into his fortress of silence. In sharing their pasts, they were finally able to leave them there. Leo, seeing his mother's strength and Silas's steady presence, blossomed. His silence was replaced with a torrent of questions, his laughter echoing across the yard. He followed Silas everywhere, mimicking the way he walked, the way he spoke to the horses. The scarred hands of the man he had once feared were now the hands he reached for when he needed help. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the sky, Alara turned to Silas. "When this is over," she began, "Leo and we can't stay here forever. It isn't fair to keep you in this danger." Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then a small, sad smile touched his lips. "Alara," he said, his voice soft, "this ranch was just a place I came to die. You and that boy, you're the first thing that's made me want to live in a decade. If you leave, this place goes back to being a grave." He reached out, not touching, but his scarred hand hovered near hers. "Don't go." The marshal arrived 3 weeks later, not with a quiet knock, but with a posse of 10 hard-faced deputies, their dust-covered coats bearing the unmistakable silver star of federal law. Hobbs was exactly as Silas had described him, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from the side of a mountain. Armed with Alara's testimony, Silas's insider knowledge, and the confession of a terrified Cole, they swept through the territory. Marcus Thorn and his entire operation were dismantled, his web of corruption unraveling under the weight of his own hubris. Months later, the ranch was transformed. The garden bloomed with stubborn desert flowers and rows of corn. The fences were straight and strong. The sound of Leo's laughter was a constant, joyful melody. One cool autumn evening, the three of them sat on the porch. The silence that settled around them was a different kind now. It wasn't the silence of absence or fear, but the deep, peaceful quiet of contentment, of a family that had been forged not by blood, but by fire and faith. Alara leaned her head on Silas's shoulder, his arm wrapping around her, his scarred hand resting gently on hers. "It's quiet," she whispered, her voice full of a peace she had never thought she would feel again. Silas looked out at the vast, star-dusted prairie, no longer a place to hide, but a home. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "It is." The horse whisperer's hands were still scarred, and the widow's voice still held the faint echo of a silent scream, but they were no longer broken. They were healed. They were home.